we've tracked the history of Rome from the death of Julius Caesar all the way through the end of the crisis of the 3rd century. And during that time, I've accumulated quite a few listener questions. And the question behind today's episode was in fact asked by multiple listeners. Rome's military had always been a land-based force. Rome relied on legions, and yet Rome conquered the Mediterranean. Ships must have been vital. And indeed, Rome built a powerful navy. But this happened well before the Pax Romana. And so to answer the question, when did Rome first build its navy? We actually have to go all the way back to the mid-Roman Republic and the First Punic War against Carthage. Carthage was a naval power and had control over Sicily, right next to Italy. So how did a land-based state like Rome build a navy to defeat Carthage? We'll talk about the construction of Rome's navy on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Questions and answers 1. When did Rome first build its navy? So as you no doubt heard in the introduction, I'm going to start going through listener questions. I've selected 10 of them that I definitely want to talk about. And if folks like the Q&A, I have another 5 on the back burner that I think are also very good questions. I would say the topics are mostly surrounding issues of war, politics, economics. There's a little bit in there about religion as well. So we'll have a pretty good set of questions and answers. And I think we'll have some great topical episodes. And these will be a lot of fun for me too. I'm really looking forward to it. People also wanted to know things like who was my favorite emperor, who was my least favorite emperor. And I hope you'll indulge me answering those questions as well. And of course, if you have more questions, I can always keep adding to the list. And once we finish this questions and answer series, again, it'll either be 10 or 15 episodes, we'll go ahead and resume the narrative, looking at the reign of Diocletian and his formation of what is called the Tetrarchy, a rule of 4 emperors. It's a pretty exciting time in the Roman Empire. But before that, let's get to questions and answers with this first episode on the Roman Navy. Episode 1 of this podcast begins in 44 BC with the death of Julius Caesar. To talk about the Roman Navy, however, I want to go back more than 2 centuries before Julius Caesar was killed, into the early 3rd century BC, when Rome was a growing power on the Italian peninsula. Rome was known for its legions, disciplined foot soldiers who fought land-based battles with swords and shields and armor, military formations. Their strength was in land battles, conquering tribes like the Samnites, conquering the Etruscans up to the north of Rome. At this point, the Roman military was focused purely on the Italian peninsula. The sea was not their domain. Rome had very little experience with ships. Rome's fleet, if we could call it that at this time, was probably at or under 20 ships. They could transport small groups of soldiers, patrol near the mouth of the Tiber River to protect from pirates. They really were not effective at waging large-scale war. The reason why Rome was so focused on land was because its enemies were nearby. Their rivals were in Italy. And if Rome really needed to move a lot of troops, it relied on its allies in Italy, especially the Greek city-states in the south of Italy. But across the Mediterranean, on the northern coast of the continent of Africa, there was Carthage. And Carthage was a trading empire, Phoenicians, with a powerful navy. And Carthage and Rome finally came into conflict in the year 264 BC because of events next to Italy in Sicily. Sicily was a vital island. If you imagine a map of the Mediterranean, you would see Italy bisecting the western and eastern halves of the Mediterranean, and then Sicily right there below, further narrowing the gap that bridges the eastern and western Mediterranean. So just by virtue of its position, Sicily was strategically important. But the other thing that made Sicily a prize worth fighting for was its grain production. Sicily was rich in fields, good soil, and abundant grain. And if we went to the northeastern corner of Sicily, we would find the ancient city of Messina. And this was a port city that controlled the narrow channel between Italy and Sicily, and much of the Mediterranean trade between East and Western Mediterranean went through that strait called the Strait of Messina. And in the year 264 BC, Messina was held by a group called the Mamertines. These were mercenaries who had seized the city several years earlier. Originally, they were hired by the king of Sicily's largest city, the city of Syracuse. Syracuse was a Greek city a little bit further down the east coast. Unfortunately for the king, the Mamertines that he hired, these mercenaries, they turned rogue and began raiding the channel. They turned into pirates, essentially. And so in 264 BC, the king, his name was Hiero II, decided to invade the northern part of Sicily and retake Messina from the Mamertines. The Mamertines decided to ask help from Carthage. Carthage had ships. Carthage also would have loved to have controlled Sicily. There were plenty of Phoenician colonies already allied with Carthage on Sicily. So they were happy to intervene. So the Carthaginian ships arrived at Messina, drove off the forces of the Syracusan king, and decided to camp out and occupy the city of Messina. The Mamertines were now trapped. They wanted Carthaginian help, not Carthaginian overlords. And so the Mamertines now appealed to the other large power in the Mediterranean. This, of course, was Rome. Now, this is Rome in the middle of the Republic, so there are no emperors. Rome is ruled by the Senate. And so when the Senate heard that the Mamertines wanted their help, they debated. And the answer was not obvious. Carthage had immense naval strength, and open war with Carthage might prove risky or even disastrous for Rome. And so the Senate did something that they rarely did. They decided not to decide, and they instead punted the question to the soldiers themselves. Rome and the Republic had a large voting assembly called the Centuriate Assembly. It was composed of all military-aged men in the city. This assembly could vote on matters of war and peace, and so the Senate asked this assembly whether they wanted to go to the aid of the Mamertines in Messina, to cross over to Sicily and open up a war with Carthage. When the vote was taken, Rome's military decided yes, they wanted to fight Carthage. Their help was sought by the Mamertines. They felt a duty to intervene, and so the First Punic War was started by vote of the Centuriate Assembly. And so the next year, 263 BC, Rome sent 2 armies to Sicily, led by 2 commanders, the consuls. And if you remember from other episodes of the podcast, the consuls were the highest elected officials serving 1-year terms in the Roman Republic. They not only had executive authority in the city of Rome, but they were also called upon to lead armies in war. And so both consuls took armies to Sicily. The Romans also were able to secure an alliance with Hiero II, that king of Syracuse. He also did not want Carthage taking over Sicily. So now with Syracusan help, Rome used its legions to take the cities of Sicily, including the Carthaginian city of Agrigentum on the south coast of Sicily, sacking it, taking slaves and plunder, but also suffering some losses. Carthage, however, was always able to outmaneuver Rome on sea. So when Rome conquered a city in Sicily, but then had to march its soldiers across the uneven terrain of Sicily to go somewhere else, Carthage could then quickly use its navy to recapture the cities that Rome had taken. The Romans at this point were not merely content to have rescued the Mamertines. Obviously, the war was now about much more than that. They wanted to take Sicily and hold it. But the fact that Rome was superior by land and Carthage was superior by sea, and they were both trying to take an island, this meant that there was effectively a stalemate. And we have a history of the First Punic War written by a Greek historian named Polybius in the 2nd century BC. This is what he says about the thinking of the Roman Senate at the time of this stalemate in the 260s BC. Quote, "Because the Carthaginians maintained without any trouble the command of the sea, the fortunes of the war continued to hang in the balance. While many inland cities joined the Romans from dread of their land forces, still more seaboard cities deserted the Roman cause in terror of the Carthaginian fleet. Hence, when the Romans saw that the balance of the war tended more and more to shift to this side or to that, and that Italy was frequently ravaged by naval forces, while Africa remained entirely free from damage, they took urgent steps to get on the sea like the Carthaginians." That's book 1 of Polybius's history. So now by the year 261, 3 years into the First Punic War, Rome decided to challenge Carthage at sea. Polybius says that the Romans constructed 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. So 120 ships, obviously a major increase from the 20 or so ships they had at this point. Rome, however, did not have much of a shipbuilding tradition. So how were they able to construct this fleet? Well, a stroke of fortune helped them out. Polybius says this: "The Carthaginians attacked the Romans as they were crossing the Straits of Messina, and one of the Carthaginian ships advanced too far in its eagerness to overtake the Romans, and running aground, fell into the hands of the Romans. This ship they used as a model and built their whole fleet on its pattern. And if this had not occurred, the Romans would have been entirely prevented from carrying out their design by lack of practical knowledge." So a wrecked Carthaginian ship served the Romans as a template for the ships that they would build. And within several months, with the help of their allies, they were able to build a fleet. And even then, while the ships were being constructed, Polybius tells us that the Romans constructed rowers' benches on the dry land in order to train their men in the coordinated rowing that would be needed to use the ships. Now, what were these ships, these quinqueremes and triremes? Quinquereme means 5 oar. These are large ships about 45 meters long with roughly 300 rowers across 3 banks, some of the oars manned by multiple rowers. Triremes were similar ships, but smaller, with about 120 rowers instead of 300. Both ships would have had bronze rams at the bow to smash into enemy hulls. And indeed, some rams that were used in this war were found off the coast of the Agadi Islands, inscribed with the names of their commanders. And to get to ramming speed, the rowers largely provided the muscle, although in some cases the Romans may have used sails to help get momentum. We're also told by Polybius that the Roman ships had additions that the Carthaginian ships did not have. Supposedly, the Romans designed a boarding bridge about 4 feet wide and 36 feet long, with a spike at the end. This bridge was on hinges and held upright when the ship was sailing, and then when the Roman ship came alongside a Carthaginian ship, they would swing the bridge around, smash it down with the spike driving into the deck of the enemy ship. The Romans could then march their soldiers across this bridge and take the Carthaginian ship without sinking it, thus capturing another ship for their growing fleet. So it was a way for the land-based Roman army to use their advantage and their tactics in sea battles. Pretty clever idea. The problem, however, was that this large bridge, especially when it was upright, led to imbalances in the ships. And if the seas became choppy or if there were storms, the weight of the bridge may have caused some Roman ships to sink. And so it was not an innovation that lasted beyond the First Punic War. In 260 BC, the Roman fleet faced its first test at the Battle of Mylae off Sicily's northern coast. Gaius Duilius was the consul leading the fleet, and he led all 130 of Rome's ships against the Carthaginians, who also brought 130 ships or thereabouts. So it was a fairly evenly matched battle. The Carthaginians assumed that they were going to win this without any problems. Their ships were faster and smaller. They were also far more experienced at naval warfare. The Romans were piloting these big hulking ships and didn't know what they were doing. So of course the Carthaginians were going to win, right? But when the Carthaginian ships eagerly attacked the Romans used those bridges to capture about 20 Carthaginian ships. And at this point, the rest of the Carthaginian fleet realized that they were not going to win this battle. And so they now used their speed for flight instead of fight, running away from the Roman ships. And the Romans had a major naval victory now under their belt. The commander in that battle, Gaius Duilius, was honored in spectacular fashion in Rome. This was the first time the Romans would have a triumphal parade for a naval victory. Gaius Duilius was also given a column in the city, and while the column itself no longer survives, parts of the inscription do. This is part of what the inscription says. He captured the city of Masella by storm, and in the same command, he as consul performed an exploit in his ships at sea, the first Roman to do so. The first he was to equip and train crews and fleets of fighting ships, and with these ships he defeated in battle on the high seas the Carthaginian fleets, and likewise all the most mighty troops of the Carthaginians in the presence of Hannibal, their admiral. He took 3,600 pieces of gold and 100,000 pieces of silver. He celebrated a naval triumph and bestowed a gift of money on the people and led many Carthaginian captives in front of his chariot. That's the inscription from the base of the Column Rostrata, now on display in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. Within about 4 years, by 256 BC, the Roman fleet had more than doubled, over 330 ships. Now, not all of those were new ships. Many of those were ships added by their Italian allies. At this point, Rome was strong enough to attempt to invade North Africa, the home base of Carthage itself. And although the Romans won initial victories in that invasion, the terms they presented to the Carthaginians, demanding their surrender, were rejected. At this point, the Carthaginians were fighting for their lives, and in their desperation, were able to hold back the Romans from taking North Africa. They were also helped by the weather. Storms took a toll on Roman ships. Due to the heavy bridges on their decks, perhaps more than 100 Roman ships were lost in this way. And so by the 240s, both sides continued at a stalemate and were effectively drained of resources. Eventually, somebody had to break, and it was Carthage that broke first. They ceded Sicily to the Romans, paid 2,200 silver talents, and Sicily became Rome's first province, ending the First Punic War. The coins that were minted after this war, unsurprisingly, show the prows of ships, reflecting the fact that the Romans had built a navy and had used it to defeat the Carthaginians. They were proud. But the Romans had also been drained of manpower. Polybius suggests that over 50,000 Romans had died. So the victory came, but the cost was tremendously high. So that's how Rome came to have a navy. And the significance of what happened during the First Punic War reached beyond that period and beyond the Italian peninsula. The victory over Carthage and the acquisition of Sicily marked the start of Rome's Mediterranean dominance and arguably the beginning of Rome's larger empire. Sicily became a crucial breadbasket for Rome, enabling the city's population to expand rapidly. Not long after the First Punic War, Sardinia and Corsica would also become Roman provinces, and the fleet that Rome constructed would then enable Rome to succeed in the Second Punic War, the far more decisive victory that ended with Rome in complete control of the Western Mediterranean. But despite the fleet's role in winning the First and Second Punic Wars, the navy remained second to Rome's land legions, especially in cultural esteem. Roman ships would be rowed by non-Romans, whereas Roman citizens fought in the legions. And so there was always a little bit of a lower status associated with the navy. And by the time Rome controlled the Mediterranean in the 1st century BC, Rome's fleet was largely a police force to deal with piracy, or as an aid in the civil wars of the late Republic. In most cases, consuls would no longer serve as admirals. Instead, the command of fleets were given to former slaves, underscoring the lower status of the Navy. But despite the fact that the Navy always had this inferior status, we can't deny that the creation of the Navy in the 260s BC shifted Rome from a regional power over Italy to an imperial force, reshaping the balance of power in the ancient world.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.